Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very excited to host this session today in partnership with the Indigenous Research Support Initiative at UBC. So please join me in welcoming Janice Abbott of the Atira Women's Resource Society and Fran Hunt-Jinnouchi of the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness. Today we're going to talk about some of the unique risks posed to the homeless and the housing insecure by COVID-19, among other topics. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people broadly, so the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, and that the Learning Circle is based primarily on Musqueam territory. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. Today especially, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. It could be emotionally salient, so please make sure that you're looking after yourself. If at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend or an elder, counselor, family member, whatever that support system is for you, whatever that looks like for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to that. So, on to introductions. In case you didn't know, my name is Cole. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. I'll be facilitating the discussion today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room, well, in the virtual room today, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our assistant coordinator. If you feel so inclined, please introduce yourselves in the chat box as well. So without further ado, maybe I'll kind of pass the mic over to Fran to get us started. And Fran, why don't you give us a more detailed introduction?
Thank you. Gaila Kesla, Nuguan Zanau, Gaitlan Luckily, Wheatnagwisi Quagil through the Guskimuk. My English name is Fran Hunt-Jinnouchi. My elders call me Zanau. And my dad's community is Quagil from Fort Rupert, and my mom's community is Quatsino, both on northern Vancouver Island. And the majority of the work that we do here in Victoria is on the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And so good morning, I'm excited to be here and to share this platform with Janice.
And Janice, why don't you give us an introduction on you?
Sure. So my name is Janice Abbott. My ancestors are from Northern Europe, Ireland and Norway primarily. And on my father's side, my grandmother's from the Nisquamish Nation, which is, for those of you who don't know, around Chase in the interior of BC. I am here, like you, Cole, working on the stolen lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. And that's where we do most of our work, although we also work in the Fraser Valley. And I'm also really happy to be here with Fran and with all of you. I'm going to start by sharing that I have not only not cut my hair in about 10 weeks, I don't think I've combed it either, so please forgive. I did put mascara on for everybody this morning, so that's the best advantage. So I'm happy to be here.
That's a part of quarantine living, I think. But thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it. Fran, why don't you get us started? We're going to switch over to PowerPoint now, and we can kind of proceed from there.
Oh, okay, sure. All right, so I thought I would start my presentation. Well, first of all, to let you know, so I'm the Executive Director for the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness. And the coalition was established in 2016. I started off by taking a short 4-month contract to assist the Greater Victoria Coalition to End Homelessness in their attempts to try to engage Indigenous communities to come to the table because of the disproportionate number of Indigenous people experiencing homelessness in the city of Victoria. Sorry, I had to push my cat off my counter. And so that was back in late 2015. And so here we are in 2020 and I'm still here. We're a nonprofit, we're a registered charity. And in 2018, just very much recognizing the gap in Indigenous housing that was outside of affordable or low income, but really for the high risk, vulnerable Indigenous street population that we work with, we became a housing provider. Next slide, please. So our mission is to lovingly provide culturally supportive, affordable housing and services that end Aboriginal homelessness on Vancouver Island. So our mandate is island-wide. We have representatives, chiefs or councillors from Kwakwaka'wakw, Nuu-Chah-Nulth, Coast Salish territories, as well as Métis Nation BC. Next slide. In our mission, you see this is a drum, and on the outside it has in all of our languages from across the island, including all my relations, meaning we are all one. And so this drum was signed in the Esquimalt Longhouse. The late Chief Andy Thomas hosted us, and that was the first time we brought together our elders and leaders to really symbolically make a statement that we have to get involved in a meaningful way in addressing homelessness. Next slide, please. So we have 4 priority or strategic directions: governance, policy, resources, shelter, housing or homes, community relations, and support services. Next slide. We have always set out to not be a provider, a service provider in the sense of the word, because there are lots of food banks, there are shelters, there are things that, and sometimes the way I've looked at it, perpetuate the problem. And we set out to really gather baseline data. There was so little by way of information as to the scope of the challenge. Who are we working with? Where are they from? Where's their ancestry? Did they age out of care? Were they in residential school? Do they want cultural support services? So we've done a series of research and reports. I'll just read the top one. So we did a cultural support survey, 197 people. We were able to identify in that survey in the downtown core of Victoria that out of 100 people surveyed in the downtown core, 48% are from a village on Vancouver Island and 19% from one of our villages in BC. So this really is a homegrown problem requiring homegrown solutions. Please do visit our website. We have reports. The most important one there is at the bottom, Wisdom of the Elders Gathering 2018. And that's when we felt we knew what we knew, and we had to start talking about harm reduction. And the lead from the elders was we need to create land-based healing opportunities. Housing is not enough. Culturally supportive housing is not enough. Without creating pathways to healing and recovery, it's going to be a perpetual circle. Next slide, please. So I just want to draw your attention a little bit to the counts. And, you know, in most urban centers across the country, we do counts. And the 2018 point in time count in our city, 32.7% of people that were homeless during that count self-identified as Indigenous. Well, that has been very helpful, and it kind of leads me into where we're at with housing. We have been successful in continuously rattling the cages to say, if there's that many people that are Indigenous that are homeless, well, we need to be housing that percentage, or at least targeting. And so we talked about proportional access, and we now have that in our city as a goal, supported by our mayor, the CRD, BC Housing, Island Health. And so that's where we're starting to see some movement. And then, so fast forward to here we are now, the discussion that we're here to talk about. This is an initial early count that was done on Pandora and Topaz. they completed Pandora, but not Topaz. That's where all of there's a lot of tents there on the street. Of the 66% of those counted were male, but 36% identified as Indigenous. And then the women, sorry, there's something keeps coming up on my screen and I can't see my numbers. So 34% women, and 42% of those women self-identified as Indigenous. So again, we are beyond overrepresented in this street community. You consider that we are about approximately 5% of the overall population in Victoria, Indigenous people. So we're only around 5%, and look at those numbers of those that are homeless. So it really speaks to the need to have Indigenous approaches, directions, and solutions in this whole process of housing people, or warehousing people, as it seems at times. And that's a missing factor. And that's where I see an opportunity in this, because of how I've seen people come together, that we actually have an opportunity to create some change now in how we provide the services. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Fran. If I may just jump in here quickly, I had a question regarding the counts. One of the things when I'm seeing these kinds of numbers, and we circle back to this term a lot in terms of self-identified Indigenous people, are you aware, or do you know of any kind of any population that might not be identifying as Indigenous on these surveys for whatever reason, whether that be struggling with their own identity on a personal level, not wanting to open themselves up to, discrimination or the like? And if so, do you think that that is significant enough to be skewing those numbers to even higher than they are being reported?
Absolutely. And, in my real life, back in the day, my actual area of work was in Indigenous post-secondary education. And we found that for many years, where people didn't self-identify as Indigenous, even at the university level, because they didn't want to seem to be, getting into certain programs because they were Indigenous. Or the reality is, with a lot of the people that we are working with too, many have aged out of care. They haven't had that connection to their culture. And just one woman we started working with this past week actually has reverse racism because of her, the parents that raised her really have taught her some stereotypes about Indigenous people and how she shouldn't be. So absolutely, I believe that number is higher.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And so one of the positives, but also challenges that we're dealing with right now is we were scheduled to open Spucken House, a house for Indigenous women fleeing violence. And this house has been developed with the support and mentorship of Janice and Atira's team, because it was the first house we were to open. And unfortunately, because of COVID, the developers ceased doing the work, which is really unfortunate, because we're here dealing with this crisis and having to get people housed, and we have 22 units sitting open. And so, but it really is up to their discretion. But yeah, so our new target opening date is July. But this is one that doesn't make sense to me, because BC Housing, as an example, is working very diligently and working alongside us in the culturally supportive shelter that we just recently opened. Next slide. I'm going to pass that one because I want to spend a bit more time on some of the challenges, but we have received 3 years of funding research to open an Indigenous residents managed alcohol program. And it's kind of important because that is the focus of our shelter right now, and one of the high risks of the people that we are working with right now. Next slide. So really overall, what is the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness response to COVID-19 within an Indigenous context? Well, some of the main things that come up for us is we have built relationships with people. We have never worked with them as clients, so we have contacts with them. We remain connected with them as they're housed. And so we have been able to personalize their nourishment boxes that we send every week, that we deliver. And personalize, I mean, for some, maybe there's a cat involved and cat litter and food. For some, we know that they have high chronic alcoholism and or non-beverage use. And so we will help to supplement that alcohol so they don't go into withdrawals. We're also sending things like crafts, paddles, and paint so that they can paint. We also provide sage and sweetgrass, and so they're receiving these weekly nourishment boxes that are really tailored to them. Some don't want vegetables, some don't want fruit, and so that is really a result of the time that we took over the last 4 years to create authentic and meaningful relationships where we're connected. Next slide, please. And so we also were asked by BC Housing to open a shelter, and we have, you know, not had experience in that regard. And I said we would absolutely be willing if we could have this as a culturally supportive house, if we could have a cultural mentor in there, elder, and so we've moved ahead. And I'd say the cornerstone to it, though, is the managed alcohol program. I have found that a lot of our people that are suffering from chronic alcoholism and non-beverage use are somewhat out of the spotlight because of the high overdose and fentanyl and the, you know, the drug epidemic. And so that has been a group extremely vulnerable. You hear very little when they pass. It's not like, oh, we had another overdose. You don't hear on the news, oh, you know, someone else suffering from alcoholism has passed. And so we are doing a MAP program in this culturally supportive house. We call it house instead of shelter because even for the street community, shelter comes with connotations. And some of them will say no right away. They see a shelter as you go in at night and you're asked to leave at 7:30 in the morning to wander around. So we're saying this is your shared house. There will be traditional foods, there'll be an elder. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of just getting the shelter ready and having community get on board. The New Channel people had got their artists to volunteer their time, and they created the dividers to really make a unique setting. Their blankets and curtains, you know, it's really about trying to create that space. It is not just about beds in crisis. I hear that all the time. We've got to get them off the street. We have to get them housed. No, we have to get them housed in the right way, in the right program, so that it's successful. Next slide. And that's just the room where we started the managed alcohol program. I won't go into detail on that, but again, really thankful seeing the community come together. Spinnaker's Pub, Seasider have got behind us. They're providing a portion of the alcohol. They've given the kegerator for us to use. Next slide. And we do the weekly nourishment boxes, as I mentioned, and the first week there were about 20, then 30, 40, and these are all tailored to the individual needs. And we have volunteers that distribute. We've even started that they get a bingo card with their nourishment box every week, and they can go onto our joint Facebook page and play bingo for prizes of like little treats like chocolates and gum and the things that they can access. because first and foremost, our intent here is more than nourishment, it's to help them shelter in place. And one of the big challenges is, especially for the people dealing with alcohol, is with no bottle depots, or you can't, you can't recycle your bottles, which helps to cycle the intake of alcohol to supplement. They don't have that anymore. And there was almost a standstill in traffic for panning and whatnot. So it's very, very challenging, and those withdrawals are very extreme. Next slide. Just a picture of our Aunty Glow, who works with our programs. She makes about 60 bannock every week for the nourishment boxes. That's just some of the sweetgrass and bundles that we've sent out. And we get responses. I'll get messages from people from the street community that are trying to stay housed, and they'll be like, it was so good to have those fish sandwiches. So this may in some ways seem kind of like, well, what really is the point you're making here? But the point is, it's that connection, because the risk really is their sense of isolation, their sense of fear. It's being able to connect and feel like they're still part of a larger Indigenous family and community. And the feedback that we are getting is it's real and it's powerful. And they're all familiar with Aunty Glow, and just seeing her face for them is, it's powerful. Next slide. So I'm just gonna wrap up with just kind of to recap. So the way we're approaching things is always through an Indigenous lens. Even our housing, we have what we call a dual model of housing care. Dual being on one side, it's culturally supportive. We just completed a 3-year pilot in partnership with Victoria Kool-Aid Society for a culturally supportive house. We learned a lot from that. But as I said, the second component, and what the elders said, it's not enough unless we create those pathways to healing and recovery that are land-based and spiritually based. We're still in that cycle, the same cycle. So the biggest challenges and risks right now that are, I think people are facing, is the risk of outbreak. And yet, we've had over 300 people tested from the streets here in Victoria, and 0 have been positive. So to me, there's a bit of emerging research or learning that needs to take place there, because you begin to wonder, okay, so are we doing the right thing, spreading them here, there, and everywhere to motels? And it's going to warrant some, deeper drilling and discussion. What we also hear from the street is the fear of separation. So they have their own family groups, and maybe some can be brought to a hotel and another is going to be scheduled to go and sleep in the arena. So it's like there's these double whammies that happen. Also, in some ways, wrong placement. All well-intentioned, we're all trying to do the right thing, get people housed. That's the direction from up above. But sometimes, in my opinion, when we're trying to work so fast, we're doing the wrong placement. An example is several of the women that were supposed to move into our Spucken house, they were the prime candidates to be in our shelter. But before the shelter opened, they were placed in hotels. And now they're not doing that great. They don't have the support there. And they don't want to leave, though, because they have the privacy in hotels of their own showers, their own TVs, their own fridge, their own microwaves. And so, but again, it was well-intentioned, but that's good learning to think about. It's not just getting them housed, it's where you house them. And then the real threat of alcohol withdrawal, safe injection sites, overdoses. We just lost one of our people from our Priority 1 program to an overdose on Sunday. So that part of it, doesn't end. And one of the challenges for me as in administration, And believe me, all of my family lives at home. They're in the village, they're on reserve, but there's a real disconnect, or the federal government made over $305 million available for First Nations communities in this country, and then 15 million for urban. Very, very competitive. We were not successful. We don't have a lot of options of where to apply to for some of our unique needs. So 15 million only versus 305 million. And when you consider the majority of Indigenous people, First Nations people, live off reserve. And it's our little organizations that are trying to provide these supports. And then on top of that, the Reaching Home funds, there was some additional funds made available, which I thought would be really helpful for us, because we've been utilizing Reaching Home funds to support the homeless community. And now that too has been opened up to the First Nations communities that so we're constantly being set up to kind of compete and not necessarily weave together broader, more comprehensive approaches. And I'm going to close by just saying I see, though, so many opportunities. We have been talking about the need for managed alcohol programs for 3 years. Suddenly, we're at this point of crisis, and we have Island Health and others behind us in looking at, safe drug supply, mobile managed alcohol program. So it's kind of all pushed us to that risk, like we got to just try, we have to do it. And then seeing the community support, it's usually about not in my backyard. Well, the church next door brought us flowers. The coffee shop across the street said, welcome. Like, that does not happen when you're opening a shelter. So there's little shifts. And I really pray that there's going to be paradigm shifts because of this. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Fran. That was really wonderful, truly. I have a few questions in mind, but I think for the sake of kind of transitioning over to Janice, I'll hold them until the end, and we can kind of all together break down some of these things. But I just wanted to say, I'm holding my hands up to you, really. The personalized nourishment nourishment boxes, and that the shared housing that you've been able to develop in response to COVID. Truly, it's amazing work, and I personally wanted to extend my apologies, or not my apologies. I'm very sorry for your loss on Sunday. I know that it is difficult, and I appreciate you finding the strength to be here with us today. So, Hajka, sincerely. Janice, why don't we transition over and chat a little bit?
So thanks, Fran. That was awesome. I was going to say that our stats in Vancouver are a bit similar, but they're actually not as similar as I thought they were. So I'm going to go over what the counts are in Vancouver. So as of the most current information we have, there are 2,223 folks who are homeless or precariously housed in Vancouver. 614 of those folks are on the street, 1,609 are in shelters, safe houses, centers, hospitals, detoxes, etc. We don't count prisons for some reason, which I would like to see happen. 77% of that count are men, 22% are women, 1% identify as non-binary. And while First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people comprise about 2% of the total population in Vancouver, they make up 39% of people who are homeless. Among women, 59% of women who identify as homeless are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. So, and the other thing I'd like to say about homeless counts, and I know many of us know already, but women are profoundly undercounted when we do homeless counts, because women's homelessness is often invisibilized. And by that, I mean women are staying in unsafe situations. They're trading sex for a place to sleep at night. They're staying in violent and abusive relationships, and making other choices of no choices in order to keep a roof over their head or to keep children in their care. And typically we don't count those women when we do homeless counts, and we haven't found a way to include them. So we've also done a really difficult or challenging or poor job of capturing race questions in our homeless counts. And particularly complex race questions. So questions about folks who are biracial or have mixed race backgrounds. So I think there's still a lot of information we don't know about who is homeless, and certainly we're undercounting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women in particular, even though the number's high. So what have we done? Well, a little bit about Atira, I guess. Atira is a large organization. We have about 50 housing programs across the organization, 5 different groups that are affiliated with the Atira Women's Resource Society, close to 1,000 staff. We work across the Lower Mainland. We work primarily with folks who have significant barriers to staying housed for a variety of reasons. Typically, though, it struggles with substance use, struggles with mental and spiritual wellness, and lots of violence, lots of trauma and violence, which can manifest itself in behaviors that most landlords aren't particularly thrilled with. So what have we been doing over the last while, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, since I stopped combing my hair? We have done a bunch of stuff. So we actually got out ahead of this really early for a variety of reasons. We increased by mid-March. We had reduced the number of staff we have working at admin offices. We had started planning for staffing shortages, particularly because spring break was coming up. Many of our staff are women, like many folks are who work in the on the front lines in this pandemic. So we knew that women were going to have struggles with childcare. We knew that women would be taking care of elders at home, that many of the women who work for us are single moms. So we knew that we were going to struggle with staff shortages. So, so we really had no choice but to get out ahead of it. So we started planning for those staff shortages. We made all of our paid sick time available at the beginning of the year, for example, so our staff could take paid sick time if they felt anxious or because we didn't want them coming to work, obviously, if they were sick. And then with respect to our buildings, we implemented guest restrictions early, and I know this has been controversial, and I'm sure I'll get a few questions about it, which I'm happy to talk about. This was partly to prevent the spread of the coronavirus within our buildings, many of which are single room occupancy hotels. So they're 110-year-old buildings with narrow hallways, narrow common space, shared bathrooms. And we can have in some of our buildings up to 3,000 guests a month. And I'm going to do air quotes when I say guests, because guests are not typically what we think of as guests when you're doing the work that we do. And so we knew that in order to keep our buildings clean and sanitized, in order to reduce the workload on our staff when we were expecting staffing shortages, that guest restrictions were going to be critical to start. We moved to having meals delivered in all of our programs right away. So we only had some buildings that were funded to have a delivered meal every day, but in an effort to help our tenants stay at home and self-isolate if they didn't feel well, we expanded that meal program, changed from having buffet-style meals to having meals delivered in individual containers and delivered to folks' rooms if that what they wanted. We purchased a whole whack of marine toilets in the event that people wanted to self-isolate, either because they were feeling sick or feeling anxious. We have a lot of folks who have high anxiety in our buildings. So we wanted to make it okay for folks to be able to self-isolate if they chose to do that. We started handing out cleaning supplies. So we're busy making little bottles of bleach and water solutions that folks can come and pick up at the office and take to their rooms. We started packaging up our harm reduction supplies in individual Ziploc bags so that people weren't reaching into sort of a common receptacle to pick up harm reduction supplies. We implemented a bi-weekly newsletter because we knew that our tenants and the women and children access our programs were going to be anxious for information And in a community that has such a dearth of information sources and folks who don't necessarily have access to the internet or media, we wanted to make sure that we were providing a lot of information and encouraging people to seek the right sources for their information. In the past 6 or 7 weeks, we've also set up a number of sort of alternate programs, particularly for our staff who have been doing outreach, or our legal advocacy programs where people were coming into the office. So we set up a call-in line so folks can call in if they need groceries, cleaning supplies. We started picking medicine or sage on the weekends so that we could provide medicine to women who asked for it. And that's been an act of joy for many of us who go out on the weekends and pick and bundle sage. We have made our elder and residents more available and more present to answer questions on the call-in line. But we're also just doing really basic supplies that will enable folks to stay at home. So groceries, cleaning supplies, masks, gloves, if we can get a hold of them. We, like everybody else, have really struggled to get a hold of personal protective equipment. We have started this week with a professor at the University of Ottawa on a tenant survey, because we've discovered some unintended kind of outcomes of our guest restrictions. I don't know if they're unintended is the wrong word. We've covered some unintended outcomes of our guest restrictions, and are getting a lot of really positive feedback from our tenants who express feeling safer in their homes, being able to sleep at night, and the buildings are cleaner and in better shape. You can appreciate if you have a 112-year-old building that has one toilet and shower for maybe every 20 tenants, and it's being shared by 3,000 guests a month, that the toilets and bathroom facilities were often broken and plugged. So our tenants have expressed to us that they really appreciate being able to have access to the bathrooms when they want them. And bathrooms that are clean and bathrooms that are not broken. We've seen a reduction in overdoses among our tenants and a reduction in the number of deaths in the buildings. This is again among our tenants. It doesn't extend to the larger community. And we were a bit surprised by this. And so this survey that we are doing over the next week, we have 20 tenants across our buildings who will be doing surveys with other tenants, and we're sending them off to Ottawa to be aggregated and reported out on. So that's another piece of work that we're doing. In the last 6 weeks, we've also set up 5 new programs, which is, if I look a bit tired, that's probably why. We have a hotel in the West End, a 60-room hotel, where we are housing folks who are homeless or precariously housed and who are COVID positive. As Fran mentioned, we haven't seen the outbreaks among this population that I think everybody was worried about. And I think the most folks we've had at that program to date has been about 13 at a time. Some of those have come from the prison system and don't have a place to be. All of them are in good shape. They don't need to be in hospital, which is why they're staying with us. That was interesting. We received some pushback from the neighbors. It's in a kind of quiet, very residential neighborhood, and they were a bit surprised to see fencing going up, because we wanted to create some outdoor space for folks to be outside. But mostly it's settled down there now. The idea of a building where everybody is COVID positive is that nobody has to self-isolate. So if everybody knows they're positive, they don't have to stay in their rooms for 14 days or 10 days or whatever the remaining recovery period. Most have been referred from hospital, but they can actually be out and interacting with each other and interacting in the hallways and the common rooms and out on the patio having smokes or visiting or whatever they're doing. Our staff were trained by Vancouver Coastal Health, and that's the one building where we do have proper and adequate personal protective equipment for our staff. Meals are delivered. We implemented a program called Brave in that building. So if folks are using in their rooms and get into trouble, there's a button they can press and staff are alerted. So again, we've only ever had a maximum of 13 guests in that building. And so we, while we recognize it was an expensive program, we also understand if it hadn't been set up and if we had seen the surge in cases that was being expected, that program, and may still, we're not out of the woods yet by a long shot, that program will be critical in the recovery as we move forward. We've also opened 210 unit buildings. These are leased hotels. One of the buildings has housed people almost exclusively from Oppenheimer Park. I can only tell you that in the initial period, and it may in fact be a honeymoon period, that people are thrilled to be in the building. As Fran mentioned before, it's because you're walking into a hotel room with clean sheets and a private bathroom and a hot shower. We are working on overdose prevention in that building and setting up programs to help ensure folks feel safe when they use. We're working with Dr. Mark Tyndall and hope to put a vending machine in that building. We think it's a really good opportunity to pilot a vending machine for people where they don't have to ask or see a doctor every time they need to get high or want to get high. So that hopefully will be in place at the beginning of June. And we're really hopeful that the lease will be extended, and believe at this point, in fact, that the lease will be extended, because one thing we have no interest in doing is being any part of putting people back out on the street. So, so we're trusting that that there is a plan for that, and that the hotel will be leased longer, and there will be somewhere for everybody to go. If and when it closes, or that it will be purchased. We're good with that too, but again, just not wanting to be part of putting anyone out in the street. The other building, which is also about 110 units, will start to, this week, start to house folks who are also homeless, but weren't in Oppenheimer Park. So these are folks who are street homeless in other parts of the city. I think this is a criticism, a legitimate, valid criticism that's been made by many folks about the sort of focus on decamping parks and forgetting about everyone else who is homeless around the city. And in particular, in Oppenheimer Park, and as I've tweeted about and spoken about publicly, a lot of people left the park in the last couple of months. There's always been a level of violence against women in the parks and violence in the parks, just because it's big and attracts different kinds of groups to the park. So there's drug dealers and predators, and yeah, they're just difficult places. And so we saw a lot of folks moving, and in particular women moving out of the park or staying out of the park. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to be able to also provide housing options for those folks. And then we've opened, sorry, I should say we've also opened a temporary transition house for women and children fleeing violence. It's a 49 unit building, and we've been pretty clear about where it is. It's Easter Seals House. They were unable to use the building during COVID because many surgeries were canceled, and this was a really great partnership. It's about 3/4 full at this point, and this is women and children who are fleeing violence, so a kind of a different population group than the other hotels. And we've opened a very specific called Kia, and I'm pronouncing that really badly. It's the upper, or lower Shuswap word for grandmother, and it's an 11-bed resort specifically for women who, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women who are older and who want to self-isolate. So they may be symptomatic. They're not necessarily COVID positive, but symptomatic, and have a level of anxiety about being out in public. So those are the 5 new programs that have been opened, the call-in line. The other thing I think I want to mention about the folks that we house is there are so many, and this is not surprising probably to most people on the phone, but there are so many multiple underlying health conditions among our tenants or the folks that we're working with. So in any given building, underlying health conditions range from HIV positive to AIDS to end-stage COPD, lots of poverty, diseases that are related to poverty, cancer. liver diseases, etc. And so it's really important to recognize who lives in these buildings and what poverty and homelessness does to bodies. So, you know, there are some buildings, bridge housing for women being one of them, where I believe if the infection entered that building, probably half of the tenants would die. Half of the women who live there would die. So that's the kind of vulnerability we see among the groups, and why it's so important to be on top of this 100% of the time, or 110% of the time. So I think that's all I'll say for now. Hopefully I made my 10 or 12 minutes, and obviously I'm happy to answer questions and participate in a conversation. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Fran.
I really appreciate your thoughts there, and outlining a lot of your responses sound fantastic. I'm really curious about the COVID positive building in particular, as it sounds like a unique approach to me, and I'm sure that our audience would like to hear more about it as well. I'm going to start off with a couple questions for either of you. So whoever would like to kind of jump on it is fine with me. The first one, harkening back to something that Fran had talked about in terms of the funding that comes down from a national level to communities as opposed to the urban Indigenous population. Are either of you aware of any of that $305 million that might be trickling into our urban populations through community connections or otherwise? And then further, kind of like an addendum to that question, what sort of challenges are our urban Indigenous populations facing as they try to travel home, if they are trying to travel home during this time? I know myself personally, living in Vancouver, my home community is obviously not in Vancouver. And when this all happened initially, I was very passionate about going home and being with my family. And obviously that wasn't really safe or even a good option for me. So I was just wondering, two-part question. I don't know how to word that one, but how do you think that the urban Indigenous population is facing this, kind of being forcibly cut off from their family? And then secondly, do you think any of the funding for communities is trickling into our urban Indigenous populations in any way?
So I'll start, but I believe Fran can probably add a lot more information. So just generally speaking, not necessarily during COVID, we find that a lot of the folks we house who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have difficulty receiving funding from their home communities. So that's an ongoing issue that hasn't changed for COVID. It's a battle for many folks who don't live at home. And then I think what I'll say is there's so much, again, on an ongoing basis, so much death in First Nations communities. And so not only among our tenants, but also among our staff, who have experienced loss, uncles and aunties and cousins who have passed on home territory and who haven't been able to visit with family, has really taken a toll on people's mental wellness. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I'll turn it over to Fran.
I can really only speak from what I'm hearing from my own extended family from home. Two of the villages, have security at the entrances. And so there is a lot of angst, especially with some people who would like to see family. My own son left our village. He lives in my cabin down on the beach and headed down this way, had a small job. And when he was leaving, he was told, "Oh, you're not on the list, so you won't be able to get back in." So I've been having to try to deal with that. So that's someone on the village trying to go out and go in. And again, well-intentioned, it's seen as a way to protect, but there certainly are those further divides that are perpetuated. with respect to the question about kind of a crossover and working together with the communities, with the COVID response funding, we have a really good working relationship with the Nuu-chah-nulth. They've always been very active and helpful with our organization and on our board. But overall, those partnerships are very, very limited. And so it's important to express, no matter how difficult to say it, is we are working with our people from our villages, your people from our villages that we're trying to help. And we are competing across the country for $15 million. And we weren't successful. And every day I'm getting referrals. I'm getting calls from people on the street. Yesterday, someone from BC Housing, wow, you know, we have a woman here right on Pandora. She has her 6-year-old daughter. She's Indigenous. There's no options. Got a call again from a social worker. A woman who came out was supposed to start work. She's with her 2-year-old daughter. And when she arrived, her friend's boyfriend said, because of COVID, no. Now she's here with nowhere to go. And so we don't have options. We as an organization do not have that appropriate housing. And how does that kind of bridge of communication happen with our tribal groups, with our nations? Because like I said, when we surveyed 100 people in the downtown core, 48% are from a village on Vancouver Island, another 19% from a village in BC. This is, you know, yeah, it's a challenge, it really is. And then now with the Reaching Home funds, the emergency COVID response funds, you know, and I was thinking that was going to be a source that would really help to benefit, especially our managed alcohol program. But now that's also been opened up more broadly to not just urban. So it almost, you feel terrible because you seem to be like, I feel like I'm saying, you know, but we have to all work together, but it's not reciprocal at this point to really help us to deal with and manage those needs.
Thank you both very much for that. Appreciate it. We have another question from one of our guests, Monica. First, she wanted to express that both organizations have done incredible work to adapt policies and programs in the face of COVID-19. So I'm sure, like everybody else, again, we're very impressed with the response that you've both been able to come up with here. Monica's question is, do you think that some of these adaptations have strengthened your programs in general? And will you continue to lean into these changes throughout COVID-19, as well as into, you know, post COVID-19, whenever that happens, or whatever that looks like for each city and province even?
I think it's actually the other way around. In our case, it is giving us the opportunity to actually demonstrate and continue to do what we have built as a foundation. And because of the crisis, we are being allowed to do it, if that makes sense. Our approach always has been, first and foremost, we believe that if we can create safe cultural, spiritual spaces within the context of housing, that self-identity comes a knowledge of, you know, who they are and their purpose. It's a broader purpose because of the collective consciousness, our shared Indigenous humanity. And so this is allowing us, I mean, to be able to open a shelter that is a culturally supportive house that allows for, you know, cultural workers, traditional foods, like all of those things. To me, that is brilliant. I'm happy. So I don't think it's really going to offset new ways, but it's going to demonstrate to those watching, give us the opportunity, we will show you the results. We believe in it so much. And the reason is, it's the Indigenous street community that has told us. We haven't created those programs. We spent 3 years gathering baseline data, doing survey. Everything we have responded to has been them telling us what their needs are. And very much is a need for spiritual connections, connection to elders, connections to the land.
Thanks very much, Fran. Yeah, it certainly seems that in a lot of ways, that this global pandemic, this crisis, has allowed you as an organization and as an individual to rise up and to step up and face it head on. So I really appreciate that. Janice, did you have any thoughts to add?
Thank you, host. And I've now figured out how to unmute myself. So yeah, I think that I'm always reluctant to use the word opportunity. A lot of people have died, and I keep that in mind when I talk about when I think about the words like opportunity. So that said, we've learned some stuff for sure. We wouldn't be doing a good job if we weren't learning as we go, and I think we've learned some pretty specific stuff from our response to the pandemic that we will try and continue on. The challenge is always resources. So there's been more resources made available during the pandemic than there ever has been before. So for example, the tenant newsletter that we're doing every 2 weeks, which is not an insignificant endeavor in terms of either staff time or money, but it's really important we've always tried to be transparent with information, but actually delivering the newsletters, we've had so much good feedback from that. So we're going to look to find a way to be able to continue to produce and deliver newsletters every couple of weeks. Like I said earlier, we're doing a survey right now. We will survey about 5% of our tenants this week and get feedback on how the guest restrictions have impacted them. We don't anticipate ever having 0 guests in our building. That would be unfair and unmanageable. But when we actually started counting, which we've never done before, the actual number of people who go in and out of our buildings every day, we begin to understand why the bathrooms are always broken, why people feel unsafe, why the buildings are in rough shape. And it's not that we didn't kind of know this, but we've never actually counted how many people are in and out of a building every day and every month. So we'll look for ways to maintain guest restrictions that make sense for tenants as shared with us by our tenants. So yeah, I mean, you know, if you're not learning, you're probably not working hard enough. And I think that like every other time, we're learning a lot during this pandemic, and there's a lot of things we hope we'll be able to continue to do.
Thank you very much, Janice, for that very grounding answer. I appreciate it, and we echo the same thoughts. Honestly, at the Learning Circle, we've had a lot of internal conversations about it, about the nature of kind of the pandemic and the way that it shifts the work that we've been doing, and how, although like you said that it could be looked at using the word opportunity seems very insensitive. So I appreciate your answer there. So I actually do have a specific question for Janice, and it's regarding your COVID positive building. Margaret asks, after people have self-isolated and or recovered from COVID, where do they go after? Are they housed elsewhere? Are they moved in some way?
So there is a housing outreach team that works with the guests. I don't know what else to call them. It's a hotel and their guests. It seems like a weird word, but there's a housing outreach team that works with the guests. Again, the goal is to ensure that they are housed when they leave the hotel, not back out on the street. Some of them have been housed in some of our buildings, others, like those who have come from the Mission Institution, for example, where, as we all know, there was a massive and horrible outbreak, kind of get whisked away by those responsible for that, and we're not sure where they end up. So, and some want to be back in their homes, which is on the street, and that's a choice that we also want to honor. So keep in mind, there's only been ever a maximum of 13 people there, so it's really hard to answer that question sort of in any sort of empirical way, but hopefully we're learning a lot as people are going back into the community from this experience as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Janice. So pivoting a little bit, Fran, I have a question for you, a comment and a question. I wanted to relay this one first. Jenny, and it's just, I'm only relaying it because it's been echoed several times. The tailored boxes are significant. They reflect the relationships being built to be seen as a person and an individual as meaningful. So I just wanted to pass that positive feedback on to you. But my question is, we've talked a lot about the shared housing in response to COVID-19, and you said a couple times that it's a culturally supportive or a culturally safe house. And I just wanted to know specifically what it is that you mean by that. What sort of activities or thoughts go into creating a space that is culturally safe or supportive?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess first and foremost, you need the cultural teachers, the knowledge keepers. Even with the first 3 people that we've housed in there, individuals that were, even resistant to culture, saying that's, really, they're just thinking about survival, where we're seeing the growth. And if you check out our Facebook page, one of the women wanted her picture on Facebook. She made her first ever cedar bark weaving, and she made a headband. And she's now telling the other workers that it's the first time in years that she's actually been able to turn her mind to who she is, where she's from, and the culture. The cultural mentor will open the morning in prayer. And for those that want to, they have a chance to smudge their song. We have our Aunty Glow that goes in all masked up, and they only see her through the little window, but they know that she's making fish soup or bannock or, it really is that connection. And I can't tell you how much and how many even get triggered, mostly good triggers, not all though, but with smells and foods from community, where you'll start to hear them start to share stories about, oh, my granny used to make that, I forgot all about that. And it becomes just this sense of who they are. And they start to have different conversations because we've provided an environment for that. And you saw even in the setting of the shelter, the units, their areas have dividers that have been lovingly, voluntarily painted by volunteer Indigenous artists, so that they have their own sense of space. Their blankets, have traditional designs. In the yard, they have garden boxes where they're working with our kitchen and garden coordinator on what is it that they want to grow. Is it flowers, or is it vegetables, or strawberries? So they have that space within our patio parking lot, patio garden lot, I mean. And so it starts with right from the moment of entry. And this has to do with what we learned through the 3-year culturally supportive housing pilot project. One thing we learned, and we would get the question from some of the Kool-Aid staff, the question would be, why are they so respectful in your family room? And then, they're giving some of the workers a hard time, or their attentions. And it really begins with the space that you create. And we never, ever had you can't come in if you're drinking or high. Never had a rule. We told them you're always welcome into the family room with the elder, with the food, the crafts. But they chose to. There's in their mind, they have been taught, they have learned, or they innately have that respect for the elders and that spiritual and cultural space. So it starts from the building of your program up. And so as far as crafts, they're doing everything from dream catchers to beading, and just that sense of using their hands. It's a big challenge for a lot. Fine motor development seems to somehow get impaired through the years of hard use, but just seeing them try and seeing them produce something has such an impact on them. And post-COVID, I am so looking forward to the day when we can bring them out to do the land-based healing, to strip cedar bark, to pick medicines, just to heal by the river. We go to Goldstream fish spearing, and you know, so it really, I guess, overall is that how I think it's different is than just a regular shelter is we are very much and constantly having the conversations about the emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical health. Not just physical. It tends to be the food, the shelter mat, or the bed, and right? It is about those 4 components that connect the spirit.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Fran. Beautiful response. I have another question here. It may be a little bit more geared towards Janice, but I think, you know, we can both kind of, we can all contribute to it. Melissa asks, yeah, I teach in the Surrey school communities. At a small school, we have a large community of Indigenous families in need. During this time, their needs have increased, and we have some single mom families that are concerned about being displaced. Do you have any resources or programs that we can align them with? On a school district level, they feel like they've been unsuccessful. So one of the things that came to mind just from listening to what you were saying, Janice, is you had this kind of transition, but a transition house for women, if I'm remembering that correctly. Are you aware of any similar programs or something like that?
Hopefully I'm unmuted. We have a very specific program in Surrey called Waban, which is an Oji Cree word for sunrise or new beginning, or so many words have multiple meanings. It is an outreach program for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. It's located on the King George Boulevard around 92nd. So the staff there do outreach into homes. We are providing groceries and food. We do groups there. Glenda, our elder in residence, works out of Waban, and so women can pick up medicine there. Medicine is delivered. We have a large community garden in the backyard, so I would really recommend getting connected with Glenda and the women at Waban. We have a number of programs that are specifically for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. We have Miodehu, which is a second stage program for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women in Vancouver. Women can stay up to 2 years. It's particularly for women who are involved with MCFD or with one of the First Nations child protection agencies like Métis Family Services or VATFAS. And we work with women because we know what stealing women's children does to them, what it does to women and what it does to the children. And so the goals in those programs are to find a way to keep women and children together. Women can stay for up to 2 years. There is cultural teaching, healing, support around parenting, working directly with the social workers, advocating with the social workers to make sure that women and kids can stay together, working with families. So I would also recommend connecting with that program or with Sorella, where we also work with VATFAS. We're opening a new program this year, which is specifically an intergenerational program for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women, where we will house together mums and children and aunties and grandmas and cousins. And the goal is it's a small 21-unit program again, working with BACFAS, and the goal is to have an intergenerational community of women, ensuring that children can stay with their moms or with their families. Construction on that project, it's in Strathcona, and construction on that project should be complete early in 2021. And we also have, we're doing a partnership with BACFAS right now on Victoria Drive, where we'll do supervised visits for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit mums, so that they don't have to do visits with their kids in an institutional setting. And the goal again there is to find a way to keep women and kids together. So we have lots of stuff, and I encourage that woman to she can get in touch with me directly, but I'd be happy to share more information.
Great. Thanks very much, Janice, for all of that. And I noticed that Emily has populated the chat box with a few of the links to some of those resources. And for everybody that's watching generally, we're going to try as hard as we can. Anything that Fran or Janice mentions, we'll try to take note of it and make sure that it goes out in these in the post-session resources as well, so you can have access to those at any time. Thank you very much for the offering, Janice. And if anybody would like to connect with Janice directly, we'd be happy to facilitate that as well. So I do have a couple more questions, but I wanted to kind of briefly just take a note here and recognize our partner, URSI, Indigenous Research Support Initiative at UBC. It's a support and services office for Indigenous community-driven research, and they've really been the chief kind of driving force behind this series and helping to collaborate with everybody involved to bring this together. These are a couple of our upcoming webinars in the series. On May 26th, Indigenous-led planning and responses to COVID-19. And then on June 4th, we're going to have covering COVID. To be very clear, that's more going to be about the media side to how COVID is being reported in Indigenous contexts. But I just wanted to take a quick moment while we still had the vast majority of everybody on to recognize our partners and to put a little plug in for those future events. So pivoting back, I do have, excuse me, just one moment here. So I have kind of broad, we've seen this echoed a couple times, and it's about kind of getting the word out or spreading information. And I wanted to hear both of your thoughts on this. The particular question coming from Leslie, does it help to get the word out in some way regarding these funding disparities, or are there sensitive information concerns that people should be aware of as they engage in these conversations? So why don't we start with Fran? I'd love to hear both of your responses to it.
Well, you know, I think it's always sensitive, and that's why I haven't brought it up. And it doesn't matter if it was when I was working, you know, in my village. There's always been that divide. Whether it was my sister becoming a quadriplegic and having to move, you know, off of our community into town to be able to access services. This is no different. It's colonialism. And it is sensitive because even to raise it is to, you know, for some may suggest that the needs aren't as great in one area or the other. But when we're talking about the Indigenous street community, those experiencing homelessness, the numbers are far too high, and the number of Indigenous organizations that are urban that have specifically housing as their focus or mandate are far too low. And so if anything, that's more what I would like to have our leaders in the Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, think about, because especially the political leaders who can influence policy and address structural barriers can really begin, especially post-COVID, to say, wow, how do we create a way to work together? Because, you know, these are our people. And also the other way, we work with people who would love to be able to go home. Their choice is actually not being on the street, but a lack of housing at home or a lack of employment opportunity, and being able to, you know, better connect with, say, how do we help to transition that person home? When we did do a survey with the 100 people, we actually, well, we asked 3 questions. Where do you want to be in 3 years? What barriers might come up, and what can support you? And we heard it often. People wanted to be able to be at home in their home communities. And one of the things that they said that could support them was a transition house till they could go home. And so that was brand new to me. That was good learning. So that would require, you know, the communities and urban to work together to look at. So it's not just one way, but it requires much deeper thought and reflection and priority setting. Yeah, it is sensitive, and I want to make clear that I'm not ever, and you know, I know the needs at home with my dad, my brothers, my sister, my son, you know, people that are on reserve, and those needs are great with overcrowding and you know, communities being shut off at the gate. So I just don't want anyone to take me wrong there, but I really want to express, we as a small organization working really hard to try to meet these needs, we don't have the access to the funds that we need to be able to do this work. And so when things like that happen from the federal level, it makes it even more challenging.
Thanks, Fran. Janice?
Yeah, so I'm trying to unmute, but I can't seem to do it myself. So, so I think, you know, it serves the government and colonialism well when First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks are fighting for resources. And the bottom line is that there's not enough resources to meet the need, and in particular, given the history of imperialism on this land. And so I think are there quick fixes? Probably not. But I think we need to continue to rail against colonialism, rail against how funding is distributed, not from an individual nation against nation, urban against rural or remote, but everybody together against what is this structural inequity. And that's maybe how we get by this. Although we've been doing it for a couple of 100 years, I don't know, but it needs to be together. It needs to be together, and a reminder that it serves the government and colonialism well when we're fighting with each other.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for your responses, and I really appreciate, Janice, your words there. I can't agree more in terms of the divisions that can happen and how that really serves no one in the end, right? So I do have a question, kind of going back to the roots of your guys' organizations. Chelsea asks, these programs both sound amazing. I particularly love the Nourishment Boxes and person-centered approach. I'm curious about how these organizations started, particularly how you advocated for funding and from who. What steps do you think might need to be taken to start such a program in a city without anything like it in its place? So we started with Fran last time. Let's go back to Janice this time.
So, so Atira's been around for a long time, and I'm going to try and remember how Atira started. Atira started like all others, as a very tiny little organization. It was located in the South Surrey White Rock community, and it was started as a women's transition house. So it was a group of social workers and financial aid workers who recognized the need for a safe place for women who were fleeing violence. When I started working at Atira in 1992, we had a single transition house in South Surrey White Rock. So it's, you know, I've been here in this same position. I'm not even going to count how many years that is. I'm sure someone's figuring it out for me. And it's hard work. I mean, Fran will have Fran's agency is a little newer and will probably have a more relevant response to this. But it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of advocacy, and it's a lot of fighting. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from and Audre Lorde, which is Your Silence Will Not Protect You. So it's about being feisty and claiming space. Also some luck, because different governments respond differently to community. So when I first started at Atira back in 1992, we had an NDP government at the time, and there was a focus for a few years on women's anti-violence work. And so stuff was kind of handed to us back in 1992, but then we had a long period of time where we didn't have a government that was particularly friendly to what we were doing. So some of it's luck and timing, but it's always a lot of hard work and not being afraid to stand up and claim your space. So like I say, Fran may have something more relevant as I think, a bit newer organization.
Thanks, Janice. Yeah, so it's kind of cute, actually. In our first year, I think our budget was $45,000. And honestly, if the Victoria Foundation didn't exist, there would be no Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness. So being able to identify that ally early on, because the first couple of years really was just about keeping my position going to be able to do the grant writing and the networking and making those connections, because you don't just start with funds. You're surfing the web, you're looking at what's available, you're going to meetings with the CRD, the mayor, you're appealing to different ministers, and a few things: don't give up, pick a lane. When I say pick a lane, if there's anything I learned is you can't be everything to everybody, and you need to build some expertise in an area. So housing and homelessness is a broad spectrum, from, you know, those living rough, those in shelters, low barrier housing, transitional housing, supportive housing, low income and affordable. I didn't know that when I started. I actually thought, oh, you know, well, we have housing providers that are Indigenous and there must be housing for our people. Not necessarily true. So there are some gaps in that scope or spectrum. And what we learned over those first 2 years in gathering baseline data is we had to fill the gap for the highest risk, most vulnerable, living precariously, living rough, and begin to build our knowledge there. And that is why for the first 3 years, even though I kept applying for funds to keep us going, to do more research, to, you know, provide some services, it really was that I didn't know what I knew for 3 years. So kind of be prepared. You'll have those visions and hopes and dreams, but you'll also find that you have to find your lane. And that's what we did. And from there it grows. From there it grows, because the people will tell you there's that need. Now we've been able to access, you know, multiple sources of funding support, and, you know, we still don't have a big budget, but we are over $1 million, and, you know, in a relatively short period of time. But it has been blood, sweat, and tears, because you can't tell your staff they have a job next year because you have no base or continued funding. So there's those challenges, and you really have to find a team of champions that are willing, and they're willing to potentially put their careers at risk because they don't know from year to year if they're going to be working. And we've been able to do that. Not that every single person has worked out as I hoped, but there are a number of things that you'll have to do simultaneously. But find your ally, find that organization, or find that mayor, or and really get started. Someone that's going to believe in you, and someone that you can also sometimes just debrief with, because it can be a lonely road in the beginning. and you feel like all eyes are on you, and you know your organization and the importance of and as Janice said, not to be afraid to, we could have easily got absorbed, because in those first 3 years of being at the tables, you know, in our city, they had certain ways of gathering information, having conversations, and you almost feel like that that one person out, but you're constantly saying, okay, but what about the Indigenous community? What about Indigenous approaches? What about Indigenous worldview? And so you kind of find yourself being a pest, but it's okay, because here we are now, you know, in year 4, we were able to get proportional access. So new housing coming down in the city, 33% is going to Indigenous. So as those open, I'm at the table, we're able to house Indigenous. And this year, we've even now been able to look at all the housing providers in the city and work towards helping to get their numbers up, because some of those numbers for Indigenous people were very low. And so it really then, you know, begs the question, because through the years, everyone was using our data and saying, well, they were using the disproportionate number of Indigenous people to tap into funds for Indigenous, but really we were not housing that number of people. But I've kind of got off track here, but I guess don't give up. We purposefully and strategically created a board, like I said, that had political leaders. We knew if we ever want to be more than a service provider where we can influence change at the highest levels, provincially and nationally, we are going to need the political will. And that's why we started in that way. And we were able to have one of the local chiefs go to the Assembly of First Nations, put a motion to support our organization, even though it's urban. That board member and his tribal council also put a motion on the National Assembly of First Nations floor to advocate for the need for a First Nations housing strategy and to address homelessness. So it's had a ripple effect, I believe, you know, and with some of input from our little organization.
That sounds a bit modest. I think your organization has lasting and long-reaching impacts, Fran. Thank you both very much for those responses. I really appreciate it. So I think at this point it's 11:28. I think we kind of come to the end of our time here today. To everybody that stuck around right to the very end, thank you so very much for attending. Janice and Fran, I can't express enough how much I appreciate and respect the work that you do, particularly in light of everything that's going on. But, you know, beyond that, Janice, your history of work with Atira is really impressive, and I deeply appreciate your time here today. Fran, you know, the spirit that it must have taken the inner strength not only to be here today, but to kind of push through a lot of this stuff that you had to do to bring the program to where it is now. I thank you so very much for that. And to everybody that listened today, I hope that you enjoyed. Again, we'll have all of these resources that we've mentioned today go out in a follow-up email. And if you missed the beginning of the session for whatever reason, or you want to review it, you want to listen to Janice and Fran some more, we'll have the YouTube session out both on our page, our YouTube page, but also on URSI's YouTube page. So the video will be available in a couple different locations for you to access. Yeah, of course, Fran, please.
If I could just, in closing, what is also really important is help each other, hold each other up. And that leads me to take this opportunity to raise my hands and acknowledge Janice and Atira, because she has been mentoring me and helping us to open our first house. And without that share, it makes me want to cry, without that sharing. So.
Well, now I'm crying too, Fran. Thank you. And it's been awesome. You're awesome. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you both. And until next time, everyone. Bye-bye.